All right. Well, class, welcome back. We've got another guest speaker tonight, and I'm really excited about that. This is a friend of mine who's got some great experience in the intelligence community and is an expert on OSINT. So, without any further ado, let me introduce you to Scriven King. Go ahead.
Hey everybody, my name is Scriven King. Prior to my current job, I've been working in and out of government service for like the last 20 years. In that I was in military law enforcement where I did security operations and law enforcement operations to include security program management. After that, I left the Air Force and went into private security for a little bit, did some private security consulting, mostly in the physical security, security system design and installation world. After that, I went to another company to work security operations. I did that for a few months, and then we moved to Massachusetts, where I was a staff investigator for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, their version of the Public Defender's Office, which is a statewide office. I was responsible for Hambden County, where I did mostly Superior Court cases. And then after that, I went back to the Air Force as a civilian employee, where I currently do law enforcement program management.
Great. Thank you for that. So it's safe to say over the course of your career, you've touched upon, seen, and had access to kind of all aspects of intelligence collection that we've talked about in our class. So you've touched upon human, you've touched upon technical intelligence, whether SIGINT or GEOINT, and then you've also had experience with OSINT. Is that correct?
That is correct, yep.
And you've probably also seen the impacts of those, both from offensive operations, but also having to protect against those types of tools being used against us.
Yes, yeah, quite often. I always tell people there's a duality to OSINT, and appreciating both the offensive and defensive portions of it. I think kind of depending on what side of the house you're on, whether you're working OPSEC or OSINT, it definitely helps.
So let's jump right into it with OSINT. One of the big questions that we're grappling with and discussing is OSINT really intelligence? And the reason I asked that is we looked early on in our class, we looked at trying to come up with or see what a common definition is for intelligence. And one of the critical components that it talked about was the need for intelligence to be secret. And obviously, when we're talking about OSINT, we're talking about stuff that's open, overt, typically, and not, in fact, secret. So talk with me a little bit about why you would make the case, and I suppose you would, that OSINT is a legitimate intelligence collection discipline.
I think it is, and I approach OSINT less from a term. I think most people think of it as a look at it as look at the product more than they do the methodology.
Yep.
The methodology is what's really important. We look at intelligence and the way it's gathered or collected differently than I think than the average public does. And so when the average person hears it, they think they restrict it to just its collection, or excuse me, just the product, right? And then so they automatically think human. Oh my gosh, that's definitely top secret. That's in the world of the CIA. So when you start talking OSINT, they're like, well, that's not really intelligence because it's not secret, but it's methodology is where I find its legitimacy.
Okay, good. So one of the things we looked at was the Army, obviously, and well, I guess the military more broadly has done a good job of preparing field manuals and just about everything, right? Obviously, as you know. And so they have an OSINT field collection manual. And one of the things we saw in looking at that was that OSINT is kind of viewed as the foundation for all the other INTs, so to speak. And one of our other guest speakers referred to it as providing the atmospherics or the context for broader collection. So talk about that a little bit, if you don't mind.
Sure. So there are things in OSINT, like I always tell people, the way to look at OSINT is it's more or less a gateway, right? So I may know a guy's name, and that might get me to a phone number, and then that phone number might allow me to go to, say, a SIGINT person and task them with the interception based on that phone number. Or you can use any of the other collection methodologies to do the same. But really, OSINT's kind of unique in that way, in that we already know a great deal of what we know about a subject, whether it be a location or a person or even an event, based on what we know through overt means.
Got it. Okay. Very, very cool. So, you talked about starting out with a name and maybe getting to a number. We've seen, you and I both in some of the discussions we've had, some folks fall back on thinking that a simple Google search is OSINT, but it's more robust than that, right? And that may be a starting point, but talk about that.
Yeah, what I like to talk to people about are the pivot points that OSINT provides. I've never worked a case or had a collection task that was pretty straight and narrow. Normally, it starts off with the principal or the stakeholder coming up with a bunch of questions that need to be answered. And I could go to Google, and Google could suffice for some baseline knowledge, but it's not going to be confirmatory, nor is it going to provide me with a lot of context, and it's not going to give me a lot in terms of different places where I can get further information on that one piece of information. I'll give you a good example. So if you look up a famous person and you're trying to figure out their address, Google might take you to, we'll use an imaginary address, 221B Baker Street in London, right? And that might provide you with just that physical address, and you can go back to your source because Google told you that was the address. But the minute your source says, hey, that sounds an awful lot familiar, where do I know that address from? And if you're not, a literary or Sherlock Holmes aficionado like myself, you may not recognize 221 Baker Street as being the address of Sherlock Holmes, and you could be very well dealing with a phony address. You see that quite a bit sometimes.
So a good OSINT investigator needs to not only be gathering data to prepare context and lay atmospherics, but also have enough context themselves to understand what they're collecting and whether it's accurate, real, fake, etc. Right? Because I specifically remember I had a case where I had a famous actress who wanted some help with, in essence, pin testing of the way she lived her life, red teaming on her. And it was actually quite remarkable what you could find online about where she lived, approaches to her house, ways around her network security, et cetera. And so understanding what's the real information or not is tough. So we've seen that in the election, this past year. We've seen it with Russian information out there. How does a good OSINT investigator go about sorting out fact from fiction or propaganda from intelligence in OSINT collection?
I think you kind of got to go back to the same questions you would ask like a human source, or if you were going to be talking to, one of your collectors, your NSA, or your SIGINT collectors, or somebody who worked in GEO. You want to ask, where did I get this information from? How reliable is that information? Am I only trusting this piece of information because it goes towards a bias that I may already have? And if I can answer sort of those questions and feel pretty good with the answers, then I feel as though the source can be trustworthy. Another thing that I often do is I also ask, where else am I seeing this information, right? If I'm doing collection on something, I'm looking at, and I'll give you some examples. So I've collected on some human sources on some human targets for criminal defense investigations, right? And Google in a people search will provide me with, say, an address. And that could get me to a door, but it may not get me to the right door. In other words, if I'm not asking myself the question of, could that person have moved? Why is this address more important than another address? This address has a PO box, but it's got an address that seems to be situated near a prison. Oh, wait a minute, my target has a criminal history that I didn't know about now. So having the ability to not just accept the information and weigh whether or not it's just reliable, but also what else it's telling you are equally important to me.
Got it. Okay. Let's talk about some of the issues with OSINT, right? The things that come up that increase the risk. And we've been touching upon one of them, which is understanding fact from fiction or propaganda and FUD from, nuggets. What are some of the other issues that you come up with or that you face as in collecting OSINT?
Probably the biggest thing is recency of information.
Okay.
How current is the information? Deception. A lot of people put out stuff out there that's just not true. Understanding kind of what's being asked and what's going to be asked. So like oftentimes you get a piece of information and think that that's all you have to provide. And so one of the challenges with OSINT that you don't always get on a human source, because a human source, you may get all that contextual information on it. It may not be readily available. You may not see it as clearly, and that can be a challenge. Some challenges you face are sometimes there's not a good deal of confirmatory or corroborative information to go with what you're seeing. Sometimes you just have to guess more than you probably would with some of the other ends. I would say probably not as close as probably to human in some respects. I've interviewed folks who gave me a lot of good information and I was a little bit in doubt, so I kind of had to guess when I went back to an attorney or went back to my supervisor and explained the nature of the interview. But with OSINT, it can be a little bit more difficult. In your stakeholders or trust your source can also be kind of iffy, like say, for instance, especially in this political climate, if you're collecting on something or someone, and it happens to be someone who's politically affiliated, but the source of where you have to get that information from in the open source world may be a politically biased or political interest, we'll say, sure, that kind of colors that it could color that intelligence a little differently than say something else. Okay. So I hope that answers the question.
Sure. I've got a couple other issues that we've come up with and talked about in class that you might have some input on as well. So the first one would be privacy concerns, right? So how do you handle or deal with, particularly in an American society, right? Engaging in OSINT collection while dealing with privacy concerns. A lot of what you've done has been on the law enforcement side, so folks have a presumption of innocence. So walk through that.
Yeah. So when I took this job, going back into government service, I had a different sort of look at OSINT and its value than even when I was at the public defender's office, and I thought I could bring some of that same sort of openness to OSINT to this current occupation. However, I found that there's some government regulations that kind of prohibit you from the kind of targeting you can do on U.S. persons because OSINT is a form of intelligence gathering. So, for instance, like I'll give you a really good example. So when I was in the public defender's office, we didn't have a pressing case that required me to do this, but I thought that there would be cases in the future where we could utilize it. We have a number of shooting incidents that happen within my local area, and there is no formalized database of where and when these shootings occur that's open source. So I went and did an FOIA request for all of the ShotSpotter recordings. That's the system that listens for gunshots throughout the community and tries to triangulate them. And
yeah, we actually talked about it in our technical class, because I said it's probably one of it's an example of MASINT collection, measures and signatures collection, that actually takes place in downtown Boston that most people never even think about as MASINT in that sense. But it is at a simple level just MASINT collection.
Yeah, I mean it's an extremely valuable resource for law enforcement. And where I was working in the public defender's office, we didn't have access to that. So I did the FOIA request, but what I found though was tons and tons of information that was extremely valuable for me. So not only does ShotSpotter record gunshots, but it can record fireworks. And if I'm dealing with a shooting where the shooting may be in dispute, and I'm talking to someone and they say, well, they thought they heard a number of gunshots, but ShotSpotter and a nearby neighborhood may have picked up something that was not gunshots but fireworks, that may have some weight on the case. Now that information is available to me, and I can use it. In the military world, if I were going to take on such a collection, that would be fine, but I couldn't do it under the auspices of collecting for specific criminal activity.
Right.
Whereas the public defender's world, that was just something that I could just do. And so I have to kind of weigh that. But those are some of the unique challenges you face in terms of privacy concerns as far as OSINT concerned. I run into privacy concerns as I'm looking at other people's information and how readily available it is. And that's a whole other topic in and of itself. But I mean, there's a good deal of information that's out there.
So another one that comes up, almost all of us, and I'm using this example specifically for our class, almost all of us have inadvertently stalked somebody on Instagram or Facebook or, whatever, somebody that we know that we didn't want them to know that we were stalking them. And many folks have inadvertently liked a post or, et cetera, before they realized that they'd done it. And therefore they alerted, in essence, their target that they were being watched. So how does an OSINT collector go about that, without getting into sources and methods, but what are the concerns in that world with keeping your target unaware that they're a target of collection?
Yeah, so when I first started off at OSINT, I never, there wasn't a whole lot of reach back because most of the intelligence that I was gathering, and I've been doing OSINT. I always joke with people since I was 13 or 14 years old and had a library card because my mom would be looking for classmates. So I would go to the local library and get all the yearbooks that I could find, all the microfiche stuff, and look through the phone books. But there was no reach back. Like if I made a mistake collecting that, chances are the classmates I was looking for would never, ever even know I was looking for. Now, fast forward, 30 years, now we're looking into social media. And social media has certain trappings that, ordinary people just wouldn't think about. I'll give you a good example. So I'll give you a good example. In a case that I was working, I remember looking for someone and I had found their page. But, a cardinal rule of mine has always been to not do OSINT from my phone. Why? Because I have fat thumbs and I'm scrolling through and I can easily like something. And to what you were just talking about, it happened to me. So, luckily my subject didn't know it, but I realized it too late. And so suddenly now I have to create some sort of cover story as to why I'm on the page just in case. Thankfully there was enough degrees of separation where this could have just been an innocent click. He had no clue who I was and we were just fine. But nonetheless, for about, 20 minutes, I had to come up with something all because I was, busy and had a thought in my mind. And I was just like, well, let me just check and see real quick. And, the thumbs got to work and then I clicked. And before I knew it, there I was.
So OSINT on a person, I get that that's kind of a needle in a haystack search out there, particularly with common names. But when we're talking about OSINT more broadly, say you wanted to do OSINT for a high-powered executive who was going to be going to a hard target country, and they wanted to have an OSINT package prepared on where they were going and so on and so forth. There's so much data out there, right? One of the problems or issues that we face with OSINT collection is there's just so much data. And so how does an OSINT collector deal with just handling those masses of data?
Something you can do, and I've started to implement it now, is I try to get as much of, I kind of draw a line as to how much is too much, and really that depends on what I'm looking at and what I think the future could mean on this particular topic. For example, like if I'm looking at a person or I'm looking at a location, but I think that I may be asked further questions on down the road, I may retain more of that information than I might if I'm just I know I'm just doing a quick job here or there. But if I know, for instance, especially on a famous person, I would probably say, depending on what I'm looking at, if I'm on that piece of information, or if on that particular source for more than an hour, it's worth archiving and preserving, just for that, because I know I'm going to be back on that. For a small profile person on like a small criminal case, if I don't think I'm coming back to that, then once I've got enough to kind of confirm, then I'm gone. I'm doing something else.
Got it.
Just because of time constraints.
Got it. One of the fun things that we try and do is when possible share a war story if somebody's got one, and so up to you if you have one you think you can share, and that wouldn't get you into trouble anywhere, but and whether or not you share it as a failure or a success, right? I think success stories are always fun to tell, but sometimes there's better learning in failure. But it's up to you which way you want to go with it as it relates to OSINT. If you've got an example you can use.
Yeah, I've got some interesting stories. I always tell people, you don't spend 10 years in the public defender's office and not come away with cool stories, nor that in the military. One of the things that I think, I'll say probably one of my biggest success in OSINT was pretty early on. I got assigned a case where we were looking for someone to be at a place where they weren't supposed to be at a specific time. And the guy was a family man, and I wasn't going to be able to bring him in for an interview. That just wasn't going to happen. And I kind of felt like that was what was going to happen. So I knew that most of this case was going to be all OSINT. I was going to have to do a lot of work on the internet. So I start I start every OSINT case, and if any investigator tells you they're not doing this, they're either fibbing or maybe they need to take a look at how they run their cases. But what I do is I run every name through Google at first, right? Just to get the palette wet and see what's out there. So I run him, and I find he's got a profile on Facebook. So okay, great. I'm thinking if he's like most people, he's probably going to keep a low profile, or he's going to tell me everything. And sure enough, he's got a pretty low profile. Well, the weakest point for most men, especially if they're concerned about their security, is their wife, right?
Yep.
Wives, because men can separate, and not to get into anything specific, but men have a tendency, at least on the OSINT world, to kind of sort of lock things down while their spouses will engage with teachers, will engage with in-laws, will engage with other relatives. And that's just always been my experience. So I go looking for the wife. The wife, of course, has got the kids' school on her page. She's got all kinds of crazy stuff, right? That the guy had completely locked down and I wouldn't have found. The guy did do something. He liked a business on his Facebook page that I didn't know why he was connected to them. And it was an auto detailing shop.
Yep.
And so I said, wow, that's interesting. I wonder who owns this auto detailing shop. Well, he does. Well, that led to a number. That number, when I Googled it, opened up other sources and other comments that showed that indeed that he did own this detailing shop. And not only that, but it led to some other comments from other people that when I ran his wife's social media page, came up with some interesting stuff. But the most important thing, though, about this story is that when I went to the wife's page, I remembered that they had a daughter, and I remember the daughter was about the same age as my son. And I was like, wow, I wonder if there are pictures of them at school, or their comments at the school about them maybe possibly not, that they were going to be at this location they weren't supposed to be at. And so I go on to the school's website, I Google them both, or run them through the search, on the Facebook page. I run that search. It shows mom and dad and daughter standing together taking a picture. And I kept looking back and going back and forth. And remember I told you where you have to sometimes archive information because you feel like you're going to go back to it? Well, that happened to me. And I sometimes when something just bugs me and I'm running something and I can't figure it out, I usually let it sit on my brain for about a couple of days, and I'll go back and re-engage. And sure enough, it hit me, and I was like, there's got to be something going on in this classroom physically. So I know I'm not going to get a chance to look at the classroom, and I know I'm not going to be able to talk to the teachers. So I pull up the picture again, and I zoom in at different spots, and I can see that there's this board. And I remember the time of year is about Christmas when they were supposed to be was when they were supposed to be at this place. And so I zoom in and I zoom in, and sure enough, I see dad. I see a profile of what appears to be dad, mom, and the daughter, all in the same similar pose. The thing was, they were standing next to a Chewbacca. So the Chewbacca that they were standing with is because Disney has rights to all Star Wars.
Mm-hmm.
To take this picture at an authorized location, I'm going to know about it because Disney's going to show Chewbacca with other families doing this exact same pose. Yep. Sure enough, and they were supposed to not be at Disney World during this time. And so I thought, man, I've got them now. And sure enough, when I go and contact Disney, Disney confirms. But that required a lot of OSINT to be able to figure out. I mean, it's not as, you know, as sexy as telling you I saw the murder case, but the amount of open source stuff I did, you know, without having to actually, I mean, the stuff that I confirmed without actually talking to something, was pretty extraordinary. And it's probably one of the cooler things I've done in a while.
That's neat. Yeah. So the story about the Chewbacca and the being able to place a known entity at a known place reminded me of some of the calls I've heard from law enforcement to have people upload photos of hotel rooms in order to have a database of hotel room interior photos so that in trafficking cases, they might be able to connect those locations to the already previously identified locations posted by others who have donated them to law enforcement for those database purposes.
Yes, sir. Yeah, that's a big part of OSINT right now, especially in human trafficking. I believe Europol has a site that they run where they show different parts of a room or certain items that they're looking to identify, and the OSINT community sort of piles in on those.
Pretty amazing, right? And there's a number of kind of freelance OSINTers out there who are willing to help provide their expertise and computing power, right? Because at some level, it's just enough eyeballs on a target.
100%. Yeah, I've seen some really, really cool things with OSINT, especially when the community of practitioners and enthusiasts get together. Just, you know, if you look at Trace Labs and their Capture the Flag stuff that they host every year. I mean, they're just looking at human trafficking or missing person cases for those things, and it's a really, really cool thing to see.
Cool. All right. Well, look, I appreciate your time. Thanks for joining our classes. You got any last words you want to leave the students with about the world of intelligence collection?
Yeah, sure. One of the things that I always tell people about OSINT is that it's easy for people to tell you what OSINT is by having them tell you what OSINT. You can find out what OSINT isn't by what people tell you it is sometimes. I'll give you a good example. So sometimes on social media, there's a phenomenon called doxing, right?
Yep.
And people will often look up people and can compile a dossier of people and tell you that dossier is complete and that's the person and that they're identified with this activity. And because OSINT is so open, it leads credibility to people believing these sources only because, this intelligence, only because it's so open and they feel as though they've got enough information when in fact they haven't weighed enough of the information when it's been presented. So what I always tell people who are interested in OSINT is first appreciate that one, it's a methodology, and two, also appreciate that it takes discipline and it takes a good deal of analysis to do it. Just because you can find the information doesn't mean it'll tell you what you think it does.
Yeah, data is just information. It's not intelligence.
Yeah, if you're not a critical thinker, this isn't for you.
Right.
You'll get washed out pretty quick.
All right.
So,
awesome. Well, really appreciate it. Thanks for joining us. Thank you, class.